The marble-floored hearing room was hushed. Every camera trained on the long table where the nation's most powerful cable executive adjusted his tie. It was April 9, 2014 in Washington, D.C., and Comcast CEO Brian Roberts was about to face a barrage of questions from the Senate Judiciary Committee. Outside, the spring air was crisp, but inside, the temperature felt like the moment before a thunderstorm. A $45.2 billion gamble was at stake, a deal that, if approved, would fuse Comcast Corporation and Time Warner Cable into a single broadband and cable giant, controlling roughly 30 million subscribers. In the company's own words, it was transformational. To critics, it was an attempt to lock America's digital future inside a single corporate vault. The stakes were as high as they come. Comcast, already the largest cable provider in the United States, claimed the merger would mean faster internet speeds, expanded service areas, and a stronger competitor against satellite and streaming newcomers. But consumer advocates saw something else: the creation of a gatekeeper with unprecedented power over what Americans could watch, download, and pay for. In the era when Netflix's traffic was exploding and cord-cutting was gaining traction, this merger wasn't just about cable, it was about the control of the internet's last mile into people's homes. Roberts began with a practiced smile and carefully crafted talking points. He spoke of efficiencies, investment, and competition with wireless and online video. But just a few feet away, Senator Al Franken's voice cut through the optimism. "How is this good for consumers?" Franken asked, "when you'll have even less incentive to compete?" The question hung in the air, reframing the conversation into the stark dilemma that would haunt the deal from start to finish. Would this be a bold step toward innovation or a calculated move to strangle competition? For the regulators sitting in the audience, officials from the Federal Communications Commission and the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division, the answer to that question would determine the fate of one of the most ambitious corporate mergers in recent memory. The hearing was not a trial, but it felt like one. Senators leaned in, lobbyists scribbled notes, and reporters tapped furiously at their keyboards. Outside the chamber, the countdown had already begun. The deal had been announced just 2 months earlier, on February 13, 2014. But every day brought new scrutiny. The merger agreement had a drop-dead date less than 2 years away. And if federal regulators moved to block it, the companies would have to walk away, potentially paying hundreds of millions in breakup fees and forfeiting years of strategic planning. Every question, every soundbite, every headline would move the needle toward approval or collapse. In that moment, as the lights of the television cameras glared and the clock on the wall ticked past noon, the sense of inevitability shifted. This was no longer just a corporate deal. It was a political, economic, and cultural flashpoint. Somewhere in the hushed silence before the next question, you could almost hear the ticking of the stopwatch, counting down to a decision that would reshape or preserve the balance of power in America's broadband future. And with that, the stage was set to go back in time, to see how two companies had grown so large, so powerful, and so intertwined with the country's communications infrastructure that they would dare to attempt such a merger in the first place.
To understand how the 2014 merger proposal could even be contemplated, you have to go back decades to the roots of both Comcast and Time Warner Cable, and to the peculiar architecture of the American cable industry. Comcast's story begins in 1963, when Ralph Roberts, along with 2 partners, purchased a tiny cable operation in Tupelo, Mississippi, with just 1,200 subscribers. In the following decades, Comcast pursued a relentless expansion strategy, rolling up local cable systems, modernizing infrastructure, and moving its headquarters to Philadelphia. By the early 2000s, under Ralph's son, Brian Roberts, Comcast had become a corporate juggernaut, not just a distributor, but a content powerhouse, with a portfolio that would eventually include NBC Universal, Universal Pictures, and a sprawling network of regional sports channels. Time Warner Cable's origins were more tangled. It grew out of a series of acquisitions and mergers in the 1970s and 1980s, eventually becoming the cable arm of Time Warner Inc., the media giant known for HBO, Warner Bros., and CNN. In 2009, Time Warner Cable was spun off as an independent company, severing its corporate tie to the entertainment empire and focusing purely on providing cable TV, broadband internet, and voice services. While Comcast was known for aggressive deal-making and vertical integration into content, Time Warner Cable positioned itself as a steady, geographically entrenched operator, dominating key markets like New York City, Los Angeles, and parts of Texas. Before the merger announcement, the U.S. cable industry was essentially a patchwork of regional monopolies. Cable operators rarely overlapped territories, so Comcast and Time Warner Cable were not head-to-head competitors in most markets. But each commanded extraordinary market power in their respective footprints. Comcast served around 22 million subscribers across major metropolitan areas like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., while Time Warner Cable's customer base numbered about 11 million, concentrated in other high-density urban regions. This lack of direct overlap was a central talking point in the company's merger pitch, and one of the reasons they thought it could pass regulatory muster. The technological backdrop also played a decisive role in setting the stage. By 2014, broadband had become the bloodline of the digital economy, with streaming platforms, cloud computing, and online gaming driving demand for faster connections. At the same time, the rise of Netflix and Hulu was beginning to erode traditional cable TV subscriptions, sparking fears among cable executives that their most profitable service, the pay TV bundle, was under siege. Both Comcast and Time Warner Cable faced rising costs for programming, especially from sports networks, while consumers were becoming more vocal about high prices and poor customer service. Against this backdrop, the pain points were obvious. Expanding geographic reach could yield economies of scale in customer service, marketing, and infrastructure upgrades. Bulk purchasing of programming could lower per-subscriber costs, and, critically, a combined Comcast-Time Warner Cable would wield unprecedented bargaining power over content providers and emerging online video distributors. For executives, it was a tempting vision. Consolidate to fortify the business against the twin threats of cord-cutting and intensifying competition from wireless and fiber optic providers. The question wasn't whether cable operators would try to bulk up. Consolidation was already the industry's preferred survival strategy. The question was timing. In early 2014, with the U.S. economy recovering from the financial crisis and the Obama administration having signaled openness to certain vertical integrations, Comcast saw its moment. Time Warner Cable, coming off a messy and public fight with CBS over carriage fees and facing pressure from activist investors, was also in a position where a deep-pocketed buyer could offer an attractive escape. And so, in the minds of both boards, the idea of a merger was not only logical, but perhaps inevitable. All that remained was to see whether the numbers, the market conditions, and the political climate would line up in their favor, a calculation that would lead directly into the cold, hard arithmetic of market power.
By the start of 2014, the U.S. broadband and cable television market was dominated by a small cluster of entrenched giants, and the numbers painted a picture that regulators could not ignore. Comcast held roughly 22 million video subscribers and about 20 million broadband customers, giving it an estimated 22% share of the national pay TV market.
Time Warner Cable, meanwhile, counted around 11 million video subscribers and 11.6 million broadband customers, representing another 12% of the pay TV market. If combined, their reach in broadband would extend to nearly 40% of U.S. high-speed internet subscribers, a figure that immediately triggered concerns under the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI, the Justice Department's preferred tool for measuring market concentration. While both companies emphasized that they operated in separate geographic territories, the merger's real implications lay in vertical power and gatekeeping. Comcast already had leverage over content providers thanks to its ownership of NBC Universal and its national footprint. Adding Time Warner Cable's territories meant that programmers negotiating carriage fees would face a buyer controlling access to an unprecedented portion of the audience. In practical terms, no major cable channel or streaming platform could afford to be left off such a system. That kind of negotiating power could influence pricing for everyone, not just the merged company's customers. Barriers to entry in this sector were immense. Building a competing wired broadband network from scratch involved billions in capital expenditure, years of regulatory approvals, and a labyrinth of municipal franchise agreements. Wireless broadband existed but could not match the speed or capacity of cable for most households. Fiber optic services, such as those offered by Verizon Fios or Google Fiber, were limited to a handful of metropolitan areas. This meant that in most regions, consumers had at best two realistic high-speed internet options: the local cable operator or the incumbent telephone company's DSL service, which often lagged far behind in speed. These structural realities gave regulators a clear precedent to consider. Past cable consolidations, such as Comcast's acquisition of AT&T Broadband in 2002, or the 2011 approval of Comcast's purchase of NBC Universal, had already prompted debates over vertical integration and consumer harm. While those deals had passed, they had done so under specific conditions designed to prevent anti-competitive behavior, conditions the companies were now asking to amend or drop. The historical record suggested that once market power was entrenched, it was exceedingly difficult to reverse, making any new consolidation a matter of lasting consequence. The numbers also underscored the potential reach into the broadband future. With the Federal Communications Commission redefining high speed as at least 25 Mbps, both Comcast and Time Warner Cable controlled the lion's share of the infrastructure capable of delivering it. Analysts projected that streaming video would account for over 80% of internet traffic within 5 years, making the company that controlled the last-mile broadband connection a de facto gatekeeper for the digital economy. For the FCC and DOJ economists, the HHI spikes alone were enough to flag the transaction for intense scrutiny. A post-merger HHI well above 2,500 points, combined with an increase of more than 200 points, fell squarely into the highly concentrated category under antitrust guidelines, the zone where mergers are presumed likely to enhance market power and reduce competition. These were not just abstract statistics, they were the red warning lights on the regulatory dashboard. The market's structural features meant that even without direct overlap in territories, the combined company's bargaining position with both content providers and consumers would tilt heavily in its favor. The math, in other words, made it clear why the deal was destined to face more than just polite questions. It was set up for a collision course with the government's antitrust machinery.
From Comcast's perspective, the logic of the merger was as polished as the investor slide decks that would soon be circulated on Wall Street. The company framed the deal as an opportunity to generate synergies worth billions, a corporate alchemy where two sets of infrastructure, operations, and purchasing power could be fused into a leaner, more profitable whole. Publicly, executives spoke of cost savings from consolidating back-office functions, customer service systems, and network maintenance.
They promised accelerated broadband upgrades in newly acquired Time Warner Cable territories, touting Comcast's track record of rolling out higher speeds and advanced features like its X1 entertainment platform. On paper, the benefits looked substantial. Combining the company's programming contracts would give the merged entity greater leverage to negotiate with content suppliers, theoretically lowering per-subscriber programming costs. The companies argued that these savings could be reinvested into network expansion and innovation, new streaming services, better customer interfaces, and next-generation set-top boxes. The pitch was not only about scale, it was about positioning the combined company as a stronger competitor to emerging threats from satellite television, wireless broadband, and online video services. The message to investors was even more direct. In earnings calls and presentations, Comcast emphasized the merger's potential to boost free cash flow, strengthen bargaining power with advertisers, and improve the return on capital invested in network infrastructure. Time Warner Cable, in turn, could benefit from Comcast's more advanced technology and broader product suite, potentially reducing churn in competitive markets. This was, the companies insisted, a union of complementary strengths, not a traditional elimination of a direct rival. But woven into this narrative was a more controversial layer, one that antitrust watchdogs spotted immediately. Many of the efficiencies Comcast touted were precisely the kind that could arise from reduced competitive pressure rather than genuine innovation. Bulk programming discounts, for instance, might be retained as improved margins rather than passed along to consumers. Centralizing customer service could mean cost savings, but it could also weaken the incentive to improve notoriously poor service in markets where customers had no alternative. There was also the question of vertical integration. Comcast's ownership of NBC Universal gave it a dual role as both distributor and content producer. By acquiring Time Warner Cable's footprint, Comcast could extend NBC Universal's reach into millions of additional homes, potentially disadvantaging rival content providers in carriage negotiations. Critics feared this could lead to self-preferencing, giving Comcast-owned channels better placement, better terms, or higher quality streams than those offered to competitors. Still, Comcast's public stance was unwavering. The merger was about growth, not control. In meetings with analysts and in their filing to the FCC, the companies underscored that they did not compete head-to-head in any market, meaning there would be no direct loss of choice for consumers. Instead, they framed the deal as a rare opportunity to knit together two non-overlapping footprints into a more efficient national platform, one that could accelerate broadband deployment, expand Wi-Fi hotspots, and compete with national wireless carriers entering the home internet space. It was a story crafted for two very different audiences: regulators, who needed to be convinced the transaction would not harm competition, and shareholders, who needed to see the promise of higher returns. The tension between those two narratives, public benefit versus shareholder gain, would become a central fault line in the battle ahead, especially once the fine print of the deal terms came under the microscope.
The framework of the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger was unveiled with precision on February 13, 2014, in a joint press release that framed the transaction as a stock-for-stock exchange valued at approximately $45.2 billion. Under the terms, Comcast agreed to acquire all outstanding shares of Time Warner Cable in an all-stock transaction, offering roughly 2.875 shares of Comcast for each Time Warner Cable share. The valuation represented a premium of about 17% over TWC's pre-announcement closing price, a sweetener meant to reassure shareholders that this was not only a strategic match, but also a financially attractive exit. The payment structure was deliberately designed to avoid triggering immediate cash outflows or massive debt issuance. By using stock, Comcast could preserve its balance sheet flexibility for future investments or acquisitions. Both boards unanimously approved the deal, signaling confidence that regulatory approval, though challenging, was within reach. The company's projected annual cost synergies of about $1.5 billion after full integration, with the majority expected to be realized within 3 years. The transaction included a number of clauses that reflected both the high stakes and the potential regulatory storm ahead. There was a standard no-shop provision, effectively barring either company from soliciting alternative offers. More notably, the merger agreement contained a breakup fee, estimated at around $1.5 billion, that Comcast would owe Time Warner Cable if the deal collapsed due to regulatory blockage. This provision underscored just how seriously both sides viewed the possibility of government intervention. The proposed timeline was aggressive but not reckless. The companies aimed to file their applications with the FCC and DOJ within weeks of the announcement, with an expected closing in late 2014 or early 2015. The drop-dead date, the final deadline for closing without renegotiation, was set for early 2016, giving roughly 2 years to navigate the regulatory gauntlet. Internal planning documents envisioned a smooth progression: initial filings by spring, informal back and forth with regulators over the summer, and public hearings or comment periods in the fall, culminating in a final decision by the first quarter of 2015. There were also signals that Comcast was preparing for a fight. The agreement reportedly included elements akin to a hell or high water clause, language committing Comcast to take all necessary actions to secure regulatory approval, including divesting certain assets if required. While this showed a willingness to negotiate remedies, it also hinted at the scale of concessions they were prepared to consider. But these carefully plotted milestones would not unfold in isolation. Each step of the timeline would be shadowed by market reactions, media coverage, and political maneuvering. And even in those early days, the intensity of the first responses from Wall Street, competitors, and consumer advocates suggested that the road ahead would be far more turbulent than the glossy merger presentation slides implied.
The morning the deal was announced, February 13, 2014, the markets responded with a mix of curiosity and caution. Comcast's shares dipped slightly, reflecting investor concern over the regulatory gauntlet ahead, while Time Warner Cable's stock jumped by nearly 7% as shareholders welcomed the premium on their holdings. On Wall Street, analysts quickly split into camps. Some praised the strategic logic of marrying two non-overlapping cable giants, predicting stronger bargaining power and cost savings. Others warned that the political and public backlash could mire the deal in uncertainty for years, consuming management's focus and risking reputational damage. Within hours, rivals began to speak out. Comcast, then in the midst of a rapid expansion and already clashing with Comcast over interconnection fees, issued a pointed statement highlighting the dangers of further broadband consolidation. Satellite providers like Dish Network echoed these concerns, arguing that a merged Comcast-Time Warner Cable would wield unprecedented control over both programming costs and the terms under which streaming content reached consumers. Charter Communications, which had just made its own unsuccessful bid for Time Warner Cable weeks earlier, called the merger anti-consumer and lobbied for regulators to scrutinize it closely. Consumer advocacy groups wasted no time mobilizing. Free press,
public knowledge and the Consumers Union issued press releases warning that the deal would create a gatekeeper with the power to dictate prices, throttle innovation, and shape what Americans could see or say online. They pointed to Comcast's 2011 acquisition of NBC Universal as evidence that vertical integration created new avenues for anti-competitive behavior, even under conditions imposed by regulators. Social media amplified these warnings, with hashtags like #StopTheComcast trending among digital rights activists. The press played its part in stoking the debate. The New York Times questioned whether any merger of such scale could be in the public interest, while the Wall Street Journal focused on the financial mechanics and potential impact on shareholders. Tech blogs, from Ars Technica to The Verge, dissected the implications for net neutrality, a policy battle that was already heating up after a recent federal court ruling struck down key FCC rules. Perhaps most striking was the speed at which the public narrative polarized. Within a week, the merger was no longer a purely corporate story. It had become a flashpoint in broader debates about internet freedom, consumer choice, and corporate influence over Washington. Petitions against the merger gathered tens of thousands of signatures, while trade groups funded by the cable industry began placing advertorials extolling the benefits of the deal. The pace of reaction made clear that the battle lines were forming fast. Supporters would frame the merger as a necessary adaptation to a changing media landscape. Opponents would portray it as a direct threat to competition and consumer welfare. And all of this would unfold before the first formal regulatory filing was even complete, ensuring that by the time the application landed on a government desk, it would be accompanied by a tidal wave of public opinion.
As the merger debate intensified, the roster of stakeholders expanded far beyond the boardrooms of Comcast and Time Warner Cable. For millions of consumers, in cities from Los Angeles to Philadelphia, the deal was not an abstract corporate transaction. It was a potential turning point in how they accessed television, internet, and even basic communication. Many had long memories of service outages, impenetrable bills, and customer service horror stories. The American Customer Satisfaction Index at the time ranked both companies near the bottom of all U.S. industries. For these customers, the promise of better service through scale rang hollow. Letters began pouring into the FCC from frustrated subscribers who feared a larger Comcast would mean even less accountability. Suppliers, the content creators and programmers, had their own anxieties. Independent cable channels, especially smaller niche networks, worried that the combined company's bargaining clout could squeeze them out of channel lineups or force unfavorable contract terms. Some recalled past disputes where Comcast or Time Warner Cable had dropped channels during carriage fights, a tactic that could be devastating to a small network dependent on distribution fees. On the other side of the equation, large content companies like Disney, CBS, and ESPN eyed the deal warily, but also recognized that a larger buyer could mean bigger checks for premium programming, at least in the short term. Advertisers, too, saw high stakes. The merger promised the ability to offer ad placements across a vastly expanded footprint with enhanced targeting capabilities thanks to data aggregated from tens of millions of set-top boxes. National advertisers liked the scale, but local businesses feared that a merged entity might consolidate ad sales in ways that reduced competition and drove up rates. App developers and over-the-top service providers, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime Video, viewed the situation through the lens of broadband control. Since the cable modem was often the single choke point between their services and the customer, a dominant provider could set interconnection fees or prioritize its own streaming platforms. This was not paranoia. Netflix had already clashed publicly with Comcast over degraded streaming speeds until it agreed to a paid interconnection deal earlier in 2014, a dispute that became a rallying cry for net neutrality advocates. Organized consumer advocacy groups stepped up their campaigns.
Public Knowledge launched webinars to educate consumers on the potential harms of the merger. Free Press organized call-in days to Congress, and the Consumer Union sent detailed filings to the FCC outlining how the merger could reduce competition. Labor unions representing cable technicians and call center staff entered the fray as well, with mixed positions. Some hoped a larger company would mean more stable jobs and investment, while others feared layoffs from consolidation. The public testimony that would later flow into FCC dockets captured a wide spectrum of lived experience. A small business owner in upstate New York recounted losing customers after repeated broadband outages from Time Warner Cable. A university IT director in Chicago warned that higher interconnection fees could burden educational institutions. And a retired couple in California simply wrote, "We already have no choice. This merger will make sure we never will." By the time regulators formally began their review, it was clear that this was no sterile antitrust exercise. The social pressure was mounting from all directions, each constituency seeing the deal not as a matter of corporate efficiency, but as a move that could reshape the social and economic fabric of their daily lives. That growing chorus would become impossible for the FCC and DOJ to ignore, setting the stage for the deal to step directly onto the regulators' radar.
By the spring of 2014, the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger had become impossible for federal regulators to treat as just another corporate filing. At the center of the review stood two powerful agencies with overlapping but distinct mandates: the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, tasked with determining whether the deal served the public interest, convenience, and necessity, and the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, DOJ, charged with enforcing Section 7 of the Clayton Act to prevent acquisitions that may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. Under the FCC's process, the deal also had to undergo a public comment period. This opened the floodgates for advocacy groups, competitors, academics, and ordinary citizens to file detailed objections. Theories of harm quickly crystallized: that the combined company could use its control over broadband infrastructure to disadvantage online video distributors, that it could demand higher carriage fees from content providers, passing costs to consumers, and that it could slow or degrade traffic from rivals while prioritizing its own services in violation of net neutrality principles. The DOJ's focus was narrower but no less intense. Antitrust attorneys examined whether the absence of direct geographic overlap truly insulated the deal from competitive harm. They considered coordinated effects, the risk that even without direct competition, a larger Comcast could more easily align pricing strategies with other large cable operators, reducing the incentive to compete aggressively. They also scrutinized input foreclosure scenarios, in which Comcast could raise costs or restrict access for rival video providers needing its broadband pipes to reach customers. Adding urgency to the regulatory scrutiny was the timing. In January 2014, just weeks before the merger announcement, a federal appeals court had struck down key provisions of the FCC's Open Internet Order, throwing net neutrality rules into limbo. That decision gave Comcast critics a potent argument. Without strong net neutrality protections, granting one company control over nearly 40% of U.S. broadband subscribers would hand it unprecedented gatekeeping power. The second request from the DOJ, a formal demand for additional documents and data, landed in the summer of 2014, signaling that the investigation was moving into its deepest phase. For corporate lawyers, this was the point where the risk profile shifted. A second request meant the government had identified potentially significant antitrust concerns and was preparing for the possibility of litigation to block the deal. From this moment forward, every move by Comcast and Time Warner Cable would be shadowed by the knowledge that both the FCC and DOJ were now fully engaged, armed with legal authority, economic models, and growing public pressure.
The regulatory stage was set, but in the months ahead, the battle would spill into an even more public arena, the fight to shape the narrative itself.
If the regulatory review was a chess match, Comcast played the narrative game like a grand master. Within days of filing with the FCC, the company launched a meticulously planned lobbying and public relations campaign designed to frame the merger not as a threat, but as an inevitability, even a boon for American consumers. Comcast's lobbying disclosure reports showed millions of dollars flowing toward Washington power brokers, with former congressional staffers and ex-FCC officials hired to navigate the Capitol's political corridors. Time Warner Cable joined the effort, leveraging its own network of state-level lobbyists in key markets like New York and California to keep local politicians aligned. The talking points were crisp and consistent. In private meetings with lawmakers, executives emphasized that Comcast and Time Warner Cable didn't compete head-to-head in any market, so the deal wouldn't reduce consumer choice. They argued that the combined resources would allow for faster broadband expansion, improved customer service, and the ability to compete more effectively with national wireless carriers and satellite operators. Behind closed doors, these assurances were paired with reminders of the company's investments in local infrastructure, sports programming, and community initiatives, all designed to paint them as civically minded, indispensable partners. On the public relations front, Comcast deployed advertorials and sponsored content in major newspapers, touting commitments to uphold net neutrality principles for a period after the merger, and to expand its Internet Essentials program for low-income households. The company bought television and digital ads featuring smiling technicians upgrading networks, teachers using faster internet in classrooms, and families streaming video without interruption. The tone was not defensive, but aspirational. The message was that the merger was about building the future of connectivity. But Comcast was just as savvy. Advocacy groups accused Comcast of astroturfing, creating the illusion of grassroots support by funding community organizations to submit pro-merger comments to the FCC. Investigative reporters uncovered instances where form letters praising the merger had been submitted en masse, raising questions as to whether these endorsements reflected genuine public opinion or orchestrated campaigns. Tech companies, meanwhile, became more vocal. Netflix CEO Reed Hastings wrote public blog posts warning that consolidation would harm innovation and consumer choice, a move that drew headlines and galvanized digital rights activists. Google and other Silicon Valley players stopped short of formal opposition, but quietly signaled discomfort with the idea of one company controlling such a large portion of U.S. broadband capacity. The battle for narrative supremacy was not confined to Washington. Town halls, editorial pages, and industry conferences became arenas for competing visions of the digital future. Comcast executives presented at investor summits, positioning the merger as a smart adaptation to a changing market, while critics packed panels at technology and journalism events to warn of creeping monopolization. By the fall of 2014, it was clear that the narrative war was in full swing. Comcast's strategy was to keep the conversation focused on investment, innovation, and non-overlap in territories. Opponents sought to reframe it around control, choice, and the fragility of an open internet. And as the first major hearing approached, both sides were acutely aware that public perception could influence not only political will, but the ultimate stance of the regulators, whose verdict would decide the merger's fate.
The Rayburn House office building in Washington buzzed with an energy usually reserved for headline-grabbing scandals. It was November 13, 2014, and the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law had convened its first high-profile hearing on the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger.
Reporters jostled for position as executives in tailored suits filed into the wood-paneled room, their faces composed but taut. In the front row, Brian Roberts, Comcast's CEO, sat alongside Time Warner Cable's then chief executive Rob Marcus, each with stacks of neatly tabbed briefing binders. The hearing opened with a mix of formality and underlying tension. Chairman Spencer Backus set the tone by noting the deal's unprecedented scale and its potential to reshape the telecommunications landscape for decades. Then came the pointed questions. Lawmakers pressed the executives on why a merger of two companies so consistently ranked among the lowest in customer satisfaction would result in better service. Roberts, leaning forward into the microphone, delivered his practiced line. "This transaction is about growth and innovation, not reducing competition. Our companies don't overlap. Consumers will benefit from faster broadband, improved video products, and expanded Wi-Fi networks." But not every exchange went smoothly. Representative John Conyers raised the specter of market power, pointing to data showing the combined entity would control nearly 40% of the nation's broadband subscribers. "That's not just a number," Conyers said. "That's leverage over how Americans connect to the internet." Rob Marcus countered that such leverage would be tempered by competition from satellite, wireless, and fiber providers, but the skeptical expressions on the dais suggested the argument was not landing evenly. The most dramatic moment came when Senator Al Franken, present as an invited witness due to his prior advocacy on net neutrality, confronted Roberts with consumer complaints. Reading from letters sent to his office, Franken's voice rose. One customer wrote, "If I had any other choice, I'd take it. What do you say to millions of people who feel trapped by your service?" Roberts' response, citing investment in infrastructure and pledging to improve customer care, drew polite nods but little visible enthusiasm from the audience. Visual aids played their role. On large monitors flanking the hearing room, committee staff displayed charts illustrating broadband market share, maps of Comcast and Time Warner Cable territories, and pricing trends over the past decade. One particularly striking slide showed the combined coverage footprint stretching like an unbroken band across much of the continental United States. The imagery was not lost on the attending press, who began drafting headlines before the gavel struck to adjourn. As the session closed, the subcommittee members made no commitments, but left no doubt that scrutiny would intensify. The hearing had crystallized the public portrait of the deal. Two massive corporations insisting they were acting in the consumer's interest, facing lawmakers and advocates unconvinced that concentration of this scale could ever align with the public good. Outside the hearing room, both sides spun the day's events to the media, but the starkly different storylines only deepened the sense that the merger was moving into an adversarial phase, one in which the cases for and against would be laid out in full, starting with the opposition's theory of harm.
When the opposition's arguments finally coalesced into a formal framework, they were as comprehensive as they were pointed. Antitrust lawyers at the Department of Justice, joined by a coalition of consumer advocacy groups and rival companies, constructed a multi-pronged theory of harm that went far beyond the simple arithmetic of market share. At the top of the list was the threat of reduced competition in broadband, not in the narrow sense of geographic overlap, but in the broader, systemic way a single dominant player could influence the entire digital ecosystem. With nearly 40% of U.S. broadband subscribers post-merger, Comcast could, in their view, dictate terms to content providers and online video distributors in ways that would ripple across the market.
The first major pillar was horizontal harm in adjacent markets. Even without direct competition in most territories, the combined Comcast-Time Warner Cable footprint would give the company enormous leverage in setting industry norms for pricing, data caps, and service terms. Economists warned that such concentrated control over high-speed internet could enable coordinated effects where large regional operators align their pricing and policies implicitly, dampening the competitive pressure that smaller providers might otherwise exert. The second pillar was vertical foreclosure. Comcast's ownership of NBC Universal meant it was both a distributor and a producer of content. Critics argued that the company could prioritize NBCU programming over rival networks, either through better placement in channel lineups, more favorable streaming quality, or bundled pricing that disadvantaged competitors. For over-the-top services like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime Video, the concern was that Comcast could demand higher interconnection fees or degrade traffic quality unless those companies paid for preferential treatment, a fear grounded in the very public dispute between Netflix and Comcast earlier that year. The third pillar centered on innovation and consumer choice. Opponents cited evidence from past mergers suggesting that consolidation in the cable industry often led to slower adoption of new technologies and higher prices. In written testimony, consumer groups pointed to a decade-long pattern of cable rates rising faster than inflation, coupled with stagnant improvements in customer service metrics. They argued that eliminating one of the largest remaining independent cable companies would reduce the incentive to innovate in response to competitive threats, leaving consumers with fewer and more expensive options. Precedent cases bolstered these arguments. The DOJ's 2011 challenge to the proposed AT&T-T-Mobile merger was a clear example of regulators blocking a deal based on projected harm to competition and consumers, even in a market where alternative providers existed. Similarly, conditions placed on Comcast's 2011 acquisition of NBC Universal, such as prohibitions on discriminating against rival online video distributors, were seen as necessary safeguards that could be rendered moot if Comcast's scale increased dramatically. Underlying all of these points was the assertion that the harms would be effectively irreversible. Once Comcast controlled such a large share of the broadband and pay TV markets, it would be nearly impossible for new entrants to dislodge it, given the capital-intensive nature of building competing infrastructure. Even aggressive remedies, opponents contended, could not fully unwind the structural advantages conferred by the merger. The opposition's case was not simply about stopping a corporate transaction. It was framed as a defense of the open internet and the principle that no single company should be allowed to wield such sweeping control over the channels of communication. As these arguments began to crystallize in filings and public statements, Comcast and Time Warner Cable prepared to answer and to argue that efficiencies, consumer benefits, and verifiable safeguards could outweigh these dire predictions. From Comcast and Time Warner Cable's vantage point, the merger was not a march toward monopoly, but a strategic alignment meant to deliver tangible benefits to consumers, investors, and the broader economy. Their filings with the FCC and DOJ opened with the headline argument: because the two companies operated in distinct geographic footprints with no direct overlap, the transaction would remove no existing competition. In their view, the merger could only add value by allowing each to bring its strengths to new markets without taking choice away from any customer. A cornerstone of their defense was the promise of verifiable efficiencies. The companies projected approximately $1.5 billion in annual cost savings within 3 years of closing, stemming from bulk purchasing of programming, consolidation of network operations, and streamlined administrative functions. Unlike speculative synergies often cited in mergers, they claimed these savings were merger-specific and supported by internal modeling. More importantly, they pledged that a significant portion of these efficiencies would be passed through to consumers in the form of faster broadband, expanded channel offerings, and improved video-on-demand services. They also leaned heavily on the innovation narrative. Comcast pointed to its X1 platform, an advanced set-top box interface with voice search, cloud DVR capabilities, and integrated streaming apps, as an example of technology that could be rolled out to Time Warner Cable customers post-merger. They highlighted plans to expand Comcast's public Wi-Fi hotspot network into TWC markets, offering seamless connectivity for customers on the go. Time Warner Cable, for its part, touted Comcast's higher average broadband speeds and argued that customers in its territories would benefit from accelerated infrastructure upgrades. On net neutrality, the companies attempted to neutralize one of the opposition's most potent talking points. Comcast reminded regulators that, as a condition of its 2011 NBC Universal acquisition, it was bound by the FCC's open internet rules until 2018, even if those rules were struck down for other providers. This, they argued, would give the merged entity a legally enforceable obligation to treat all internet traffic equally for several years, a safeguard few competitors could match. The defense also addressed concerns over vertical integration. Executives argued that NBC Universal operated in a competitive content market with powerful rivals like Disney, Fox, and CBS, all of whom had significant leverage in carriage negotiations. They asserted that dropping or disadvantaging rival content would be commercially irrational, as subscribers valued a diverse channel lineup and would punish a provider that withheld popular programming. Perhaps most forcefully, Comcast and Time Warner Cable framed the merger as a necessary response to the rise of national and global competitors. They cited the growing clout of tech giants like Google, Apple, and Amazon in the video and broadband markets, as well as the expansion of AT&T and Verizon into fiber-based home internet. In this context, the merger was portrayed not as a bid to dominate, but as a way to ensure that cable operators remained viable, innovative players in a converging communications landscape. Counter-arguments were met with data. When critics claimed that consolidation would inevitably raise prices, the companies pointed to markets where Comcast had acquired systems in the past and maintained or even lowered promotional rates while increasing speeds. They promised formal commitments on service quality, investment levels, and customer service improvements, positioning these as enforceable conditions that regulators could monitor. The overarching message was clear. In a fast-changing digital economy, standing still was not an option. By merging, Comcast and Time Warner Cable argued they could build the scale and resources needed to invest in infrastructure, compete with deep-pocketed tech rivals, and deliver better products to consumers, all without diminishing the competitive choices already available. It was a defense designed to counter each prong of the opposition's case, setting the stage for a pivotal moment when evidence, rather than rhetoric, would begin to tip the scales.
Every high-stakes merger review has a moment when the balance begins to shift, when a single piece of evidence crystallizes the regulator's doubts or strengthens their resolve. For the Comcast-Time Warner Cable deal, that moment came in early 2015, when internal documents obtained through the DOJ's second request began circulating among the small circle of government attorneys and economists dissecting the transaction. Among the thousands of pages of emails, presentations, and strategy memos was a slide deck prepared for Comcast's senior leadership months before the merger announcement. Buried deep in the appendix was a set of projections not meant for public consumption. While the public filings promised consumer benefits through lower programming costs and faster broadband rollouts, the internal models painted a different picture. Much of the anticipated synergy from bulk content negotiations was allocated to margin expansion rather than price reductions for customers. In other words, the savings were real, but the company had no concrete plan to pass them along. Accompanying those slides were emails between regional executives discussing maintaining ARPU, average revenue per user, in newly acquired Time Warner Cable territories, even after cost reductions.
One email thread explicitly mentioned avoiding price wars with smaller regional ISPs post-merger, suggesting a conscious strategy to keep retail prices high in markets where competition was already thin. While the language could be interpreted as prudent business planning, antitrust attorneys saw it as an implicit acknowledgement of the market power the merger would create. Then came testimony from a former employee, a mid-level manager in Comcast's programming division, who told investigators that during internal planning sessions, executives openly discussed how a merged Comcast TWC could use its expanded footprint to set the tone for industry negotiations with streaming platforms. According to this account, the strategy involved leveraging control over interconnection points to push OTT providers toward paid peering agreements, the very arrangements that had sparked public outcry when Netflix's streaming quality degraded for Comcast customers in early 2014. Regulators also scrutinized a confidential market share analysis prepared by an outside consultant for Comcast. The report acknowledged that post-merger, the combined company would control a critical mass of high-value broadband households, a segment defined by disposable income and heavy streaming usage, that no content provider could afford to lose. The consultant's conclusion was blunt. This position will materially strengthen bargaining leverage in all carriage negotiations. When these documents surfaced in closed-door strategy meetings at the DMJ and FCC, they added weight to concerns that had until then relied heavily on predictive economic models. Now there was hard evidence, the company's own words and numbers, suggesting that the merger's benefits to consumers might be more limited than advertised, and that its potential to reshape the competitive landscape was not accidental but anticipated. The revelation didn't immediately doom the deal, but it changed the tenor of the review. Questions from regulators became sharper, demands for concessions more pointed. Inside Comcast's war room, the focus began to shift from confident advocacy to defensive damage control. Outside, the media had yet to see the smoking gun, but cracks were appearing in the public narrative. And the next phase, discussions of possible remedies, would test whether any set of conditions could salvage the transaction.
By early 2015, with regulatory skepticism hardening, Comcast's legal and strategy teams began floating potential remedies, concessions meant to neutralize antitrust concerns without gutting the business logic of the merger. In private discussions with DOJ and FCC staff, the company's negotiators offered a menu of options, ranging from targeted asset sales to behavioral commitments. The question looming over every meeting was whether any combination of these could satisfy regulators who were increasingly doubtful that the deal could ever be tamed. One of the most concrete proposals involved divestitures. Comcast suggested it could sell approximately 3.9 million cable subscribers to Charter Communications, a transaction structured to keep the combined Comcast TWC share of the national pay TV market closer to 30%. The idea was to create a swap. Charter would gain customers in markets vacated by Comcast, while Comcast would acquire systems from Charter in other areas to consolidate regional clusters. On paper, this would maintain a semblance of competition and address the headline market share figure that had alarmed critics. Behavioral remedies were also on the table. Comcast pledged to extend its existing NBC Universal Consent Decree commitments, including net neutrality obligations and prohibitions on discriminating against online video distributors for several years beyond the 2018 expiration date. The company offered to submit to binding arbitration in carriage disputes with independent content providers, aiming to alleviate fears of self-preferencing.
Another promise was to refrain from imposing broadband data caps or usage-based billing for a set period, a concession targeted at consumer advocates concerned about throttling or monetizing heavy internet use. Regulators, however, were wary. The DOJ's antitrust lawyers questioned whether divestitures to Charter would truly offset the competitive harm, given that Charter lacked Comcast's scale and vertical integration. Selling subscribers didn't change the underlying fact that Comcast would still control the nation's most lucrative broadband markets and wield unprecedented leverage in negotiations with content providers. Behavioral remedies faced their own credibility gap. The history of complex mergers was littered with examples where monitoring and enforcing such commitments proved difficult, and companies found creative ways to circumvent the spirit, if not the letter, of the conditions. Some floated the idea of a fix-it-first approach, requiring Comcast to complete divestitures before closing the merger, rather than promising to do so afterward. But this would have delayed integration and potentially reduced the financial appeal of the deal. More radical remedies, such as spinning off NBC Universal entirely, were non-starters for Comcast, as that vertical integration was central to its long-term strategy. In these negotiations, tone mattered as much as substance. Regulators were picking up signals in guarded language and in private briefings that Comcast was willing to make concessions, but only to the extent they didn't undermine the strategic gains of the merger. To enforcement veterans, this looked like a familiar dance. Offer just enough to appear cooperative while hoping political winds would shift in the company's favor. But the winds were not shifting. If anything, the smoking gun documents uncovered earlier had stiffened the resolve of those inside the agencies who believed the deal was fundamentally incompatible with maintaining a competitive broadband and video market. Remedies might buy time, but they couldn't change the structural reality. The clock was ticking toward a decision, and both sides knew the next move could either salvage the deal or signal its collapse.
The final break came swiftly, but it had been building for months. By April 2015, after more than a year of filings, hearings, and behind-the-scenes negotiations, both the Department of Justice and the Federal Communications Commission had reached the same conclusion. No set of remedies could sufficiently neutralize the competitive harms of the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger. For the DOJ, the internal documents, market concentration data, and risk of vertical foreclosure formed a clear case for blocking the deal outright. At the FCC, senior staff were preparing to circulate a draft hearing designation order, a procedural step that would send the merger into an administrative trial before an FCC judge, a process almost certain to drag on for months and, in practical terms, kill the transaction. On April 22, 2015, the news broke that FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler intended to oppose the deal, citing the unprecedented control it would give Comcast over both the broadband and pay TV markets. In private conversations with the company's attorneys, FCC officials made it clear they believed the merger would harm competition, limit consumer choice, and undermine the open internet. The DOJ's Antitrust Division, led by Assistant Attorney General Bill Baer, was reportedly ready to file a federal lawsuit to block the merger if Comcast chose to press forward. 2 days later, on April 24, 2015, Comcast publicly announced it was abandoning the deal. In a brief statement, Brian Roberts said, "Today, we move on." He maintained that the transaction would have been pro-consumer and pro-competitive, but acknowledged that we would not have been able to receive the necessary approvals in a timely manner. The tone was measured, almost stoic, but inside Comcast's Philadelphia headquarters, the retreat was a bitter pill: the collapse of a $45 billion vision for reshaping the U.S. communications landscape. Time Warner Cable, for its part, issued a short release expressing disappointment, but quickly pivoted to signal openness to other strategic opportunities. Markets reacted immediately. Comcast's stock ticked up slightly, reflecting relief that the regulatory fight and the uncertainty hanging over the company was over. Time Warner Cable shares dipped on the loss of the premium offered by Comcast, but analysts speculated it would soon be courted by other suitors. In Washington, the decision was heralded by consumer advocates as a landmark victory for antitrust enforcement in the broadband era. Groups like Free Press and Public Knowledge claimed credit for mobilizing public opinion, flooding the FCC's docket with opposition filings, and framing the merger as a threat to the open internet. For the DOJ and FCC, it was proof that even the largest, best-connected corporations could be stopped when the evidence of harm was compelling. The collapse was not just the end of a deal. It was a signal to the industry. Regulatory tolerance for mega-mergers in the broadband and pay-TV space had narrowed, and companies plotting similar combinations would need to recalibrate their ambitions. For Comcast, it marked the second time in less than 2 decades that a major acquisition, first Disney in 2004, now Time Warner Cable, had slipped away under regulatory or competitive pressure. And for Time Warner Cable, the next chapter was already being written, as the company began talks that would lead to a very different outcome within a year.
In the hours after Comcast's April 24, 2015 announcement, the ripple effect spread quickly through boardrooms, trading floors, and newsrooms. For Comcast, the immediate priority was controlling the narrative. Executives held internal calls with managers across the country, instructing them to reassure employees that the company's strategic goals, expanding broadband reach, improving technology, and integrating content with distribution, remained unchanged. Still, the tone inside the headquarters in Philadelphia was unmistakably somber. Months of preparation, millions spent on lobbying, legal fees, and public relations had yielded nothing tangible, except perhaps a clearer picture of how far regulators were willing to go to block consolidation. Financial markets registered a muted but telling reaction. Comcast shares rose roughly 0.8%, a signal that investors preferred a decisive end to uncertainty rather than a prolonged, likely futile regulatory fight. For Time Warner Cable, the hit was sharper. Its stock fell nearly 5%, wiping out the premium Comcast had agreed to pay. Analysts immediately began speculating on TWC's next move, and rumors swirled about renewed approaches from Charter Communications. The cost of failure was not limited to market cap fluctuations. Comcast had spent an estimated $336 million on deal-related expenses, including the hefty breakup fee arrangement that now went untriggered only because the company withdrew voluntarily. There were also the sunk costs of integration planning. Teams that had spent months mapping system migrations, aligning marketing strategies, and negotiating supplier contracts now saw their work consigned to archives. Departments that had been preparing for structural changes reverted to pre-merger operations, with some mid-level managers quietly reassigned or let go as their merger-focused roles evaporated. In Washington, the collapse was interpreted as a clear victory for the Obama-era antitrust agenda. FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler and DOJ Antitrust Chief Bill Baer both issued statements underscoring their commitment to protecting competition in broadband markets. Consumer advocacy groups celebrated openly, holding press calls to thank supporters and reinforce the idea that public pressure had been decisive. The win energized these organizations, setting the tone for future battles over broadband policy and net neutrality. Inside Time Warner Cable, CEO Rob Marcus convened an emergency meeting of the board. The consensus was to move quickly to find an alternative partner before shareholder confidence eroded further. Within weeks, conversations accelerated with Charter Communications, setting the stage for a new merger proposal that would be announced before the year was out. For Comcast, the postmortem began almost immediately. Executives debated whether the company's aggressive pursuit of vertical integration, particularly the ownership of NBC Universal, had made the regulatory hurdles insurmountable. Others argued that the decision to frame the deal primarily around scale rather than consumer benefits had allowed opponents to dominate the public conversation. Whatever the diagnosis, the lesson was clear. The political and regulatory climate for large-scale horizontal consolidation in the communications sector had changed, perhaps permanently. The failure of the merger had an immediate chilling effect on other potential megadeals in the industry. Bankers and corporate strategists quietly reevaluated transactions in the pipeline, aware that the Comcast TWC collapse had set a new, higher bar for demonstrating that a merger of giants could serve the public interest. And as competitors began repositioning themselves in the wake of the decision, the communications market was already shifting toward a new equilibrium that would define the industry's next chapter.
The collapse of the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger sent shockwaves far beyond the two companies, reshaping the competitive landscape of the U.S. telecommunications industry almost overnight. Rivals, investors, and regulators all recalibrated their strategies in response to the clear signal that Washington was no longer willing to rubber-stamp mega-mergers in the broadband space. The most immediate beneficiary was Charter Communications, a smaller but ambitious cable operator that had already made an unsuccessful run at acquiring Time Warner Cable in early 2014. Within weeks of Comcast's withdrawal, Charter re-entered the conversation, buoyed by the knowledge that its smaller scale and lack of vertical integration into content ownership might make it a more palatable suitor to regulators. By May 2015, reports surfaced that Charter was preparing a new bid for TWC, this time structured to avoid the political landmines that had doomed the Comcast deal. In contrast to Comcast's commanding market share, a combined Charter TWC would have a smaller national footprint, and Charter could position itself as a challenger brand rather than a dominant gatekeeper. That narrative, coupled with the public's lingering fatigue over Comcast's customer service reputation, gave the proposal a fundamentally different political profile. For the broader industry, the failed merger became a cautionary tale. AT&T and DirecTV, whose own merger was pending review at the time, redoubled their efforts to frame their deal as pro-competitive, emphasizing differences in their core markets and downplaying the potential for consumer harm. Smaller ISPs and regional cable companies saw opportunity in the regulatory pushback, marketing themselves as the local alternative to the national giants and lobbying for policies to make it easier to expand their networks. Content providers also adjusted their strategies. Knowing that Comcast's bargaining power had been capped, programmers sensed slightly more breathing room in carriage negotiations. Independent channels that had feared being dropped in a post-merger consolidation now found themselves with a temporary reprieve, though they remained wary of future deals that might resurrect similar risks. Streaming services, too, interpreted the decision as a win, believing it reduced the likelihood of aggressive paid peering demands from an even larger Comcast. On Wall Street, the new equilibrium was apparent. Analysts began to price in higher regulatory risk for any large horizontal consolidation in telecom, advising clients to focus on vertical or adjacent market deals instead. The chilling effect extended beyond cable. Even in wireless, where competition was stronger, companies were careful to structure mergers in ways that could survive heightened scrutiny. Perhaps the most enduring ripple was cultural. The case emboldened regulators and public interest groups to believe they could take on and defeat the largest corporate players in the communications sector. It created a political precedent that concentrated broadband control was a red line, even without direct geographic overlap between merging parties. That precedent would reverberate in later debates over net neutrality, spectrum auctions, and the role of tech giants entering the connectivity space. For Comcast, the industry's shift meant recalibrating growth ambitions away from transformative acquisitions towards incremental expansion, technology upgrades, and strategic partnerships. For Time Warner Cable, it meant embracing a new courtship that would, in time,
lead to a different kind of merger, one that would be judged under the long shadow of the failed deal with Comcast.
When the dust settled, the collapse of the Comcast-Time Warner cable merger was more than just a one-off defeat. It became a benchmark in modern antitrust enforcement, a case destined to be cited in policy debates, law school seminars, and future merger reviews. For the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division, it was a showcase of their willingness to challenge a deal even without direct geographic overlap, relying instead on theories of harm that emphasized vertical leverage, coordinated effects, and control over essential infrastructure. For the Federal Communications Commission, it was proof that the public interest standard could be wielded forcefully to protect not only competition but also the openness and accessibility of the Internet. In the months following the withdrawal, speeches from senior DOJ officials began referencing the case as a turning point. Assistant Attorney General Bill Baer described it as a clear example of how market structure combined with foreseeable behavior can create an unacceptable risk to competition and consumers. The FCC's Tom Wheeler, in public remarks, underscored that concentrated control over broadband access was inherently a public interest question, and that future mergers in the sector would face similar scrutiny. The policy ripples extended into the drafting of the DOJ and FTC's revised horizontal merger guidelines. While the core framework remained unchanged, the enforcement agencies began signaling a greater willingness to treat broadband infrastructure as a critical input market, one where excessive concentration could threaten downstream innovation in content and applications. In Europe, regulators took note, drawing parallels to their own interventions in telecom mergers and reinforcing the digital single market's emphasis on open access. In legislative circles, the case became ammunition for lawmakers seeking to bolster antitrust law in the tech and telecom sectors. Some floated the idea of codifying net neutrality principles into statute, arguing that the FCC's ability to block mergers on those grounds was too dependent on shifting political leadership. Others used the case to advocate for lowering the threshold for merger challenges in industries with high barriers to entry, where the risk of irreversible harm was especially acute. The Comcast TWC outcome also influenced how companies approached merger planning. Legal teams began stress testing proposed transactions, not just against standard HHI calculations, but also against potential narrative risk, the likelihood that public perception could turn a technical antitrust case into a political cause célèbre. Executives were cautioned to build in consumer-facing benefits that were both verifiable and enforceable, recognizing that unsubstantiated claims of efficiency would no longer survive close examination. Perhaps most importantly, the case set a psychological precedent. For years, large incumbents had assumed that regulatory challenges to mega deals could be neutralized with a combination of lobbying muscle, public relations, and targeted concessions. The defeat of this merger shattered that assumption, showing that a well-organized coalition of regulators, consumer advocates, and industry rivals could hold the line against unprecedented consolidation. In the years to follow, when telecom and tech mergers landed on the desks of antitrust enforcers, the shadow of Comcast Time Warner Cable loomed large. Whether in quiet pre-merger discussions or in open courtroom battles, one lesson resonated. Size, in and of itself, had become a liability, and the burden was now squarely on the merging parties to prove, with evidence rather than rhetoric, that bigger could also mean better for the public.
In the post-mortem analyses that followed the collapse, the Comcast Time Warner Cable case became a textbook study in how strategy, messaging, and regulatory dynamics can intersect to decide the fate of a mega deal. For executives, the lessons were sobering. and, in some respects, counterintuitive. The first was about timing. Comcast pursued the merger at a moment when public distrust toward large telecom and cable companies was already high, amplified by net neutrality debates and a wave of consumer frustration over rising bills and poor service. In hindsight, the political environment was stacked against any transaction that could be framed as further concentrating control. A more strategic approach might have been to wait for a regulatory climate less charged by broadband policy battles, or to sequence the merger after demonstrating significant, measurable improvements in customer satisfaction that could blunt opposition narratives. The second lesson centered on narrative control. From the outset, the companies built their public case primarily around scale efficiencies and shareholder value. While compelling to investors, these arguments left a vacuum for opponents to fill with stories of monopolistic control, degraded service, and threats to internet freedom. Successful merger advocacy in politically sensitive sectors requires a parallel consumer-facing narrative that is concrete, verifiable, and emotionally resonant, not just promises of innovation, but specific, enforceable benefits that the average household can understand and measure. Data discipline emerged as the third critical lesson. The smoking gun documents that undermined Comcast's credibility were not unusual in corporate strategy planning, but their existence and discovery through regulatory subpoenas exposed a gap between public commitments and internal expectations. For any merger likely to face deep scrutiny, companies must ensure that internal analyses are consistent with the story they are prepared to defend in court or before regulators. Divergence between private strategy and public advocacy can become the Achilles heel of an otherwise defensible transaction. The fourth takeaway was about remedy design. Comcast's proposed concessions were reactive, surfacing only after opposition solidified, and were seen by regulators as insufficient to address the structural risks. A more proactive fix-it-first strategy, identifying divestitures, long-term behavioral commitments, or even partial vertical separations before filing, might have improved the deal's chances. However, the company's unwillingness to contemplate divesting NBCUniversal or materially reducing its post-merger broadband footprint meant that the remedies offered were never transformative enough to shift the regulatory calculus. Finally, the deal reinforced the importance of understanding the regulator as an independent stakeholder with its own incentives, not just an obstacle to overcome. Both the FCC and DOJ were operating in a broader political context, with leadership eager to demonstrate their relevance in protecting consumers in a rapidly evolving digital economy. Ignoring those institutional dynamics and assuming that lobbying and precedent alone would carry the day proved to be a costly miscalculation. For corporate leaders, the collapse of the Comcast-Time Warner cable merger was not just a cautionary tale about size and market power, it was a reminder that in modern antitrust enforcement, success hinges on aligning strategic goals with a regulatory narrative that withstands both economic modeling and political scrutiny. Future deals in this sector would either absorb these lessons or risk joining this one as a case study in how not to merge.
When the final chapter of the Comcast-Time Warner cable saga closed in April 2015, it left behind a vacuum, not only in corporate strategy rooms, but in the broader conversation about the future of broadband, media, and competition in America. The deal's collapse answered one question decisively. The U.S. government was willing to block a merger of two giants, even without direct geographic overlap. But it also raised a cascade of new ones that would linger long after the headlines faded. For Comcast, the retreat forced a rethinking of growth strategy. If scale through horizontal acquisition was off the table, what other pathways remained? The company could double down on vertical integration, expand internationally, or focus on organic growth through technology upgrades and new services. Yet each option carried its own risks, and in the wake of the merger's failure, every move would be scrutinized through the lens of antitrust sensitivity. Would Comcast attempt another transformative deal? Or would the shadow of 2015 make such ambitions politically untenable for years? Time Warner Cable, meanwhile, quickly became the subject of new courtship. Within a month, Charter Communications made its move, crafting a proposal designed to clear the regulatory hurdles that Comcast could not. That transaction, announced later in 2015 and completed in 2016, would reshape the cable map once again, but under a different narrative, one that positioned Charter as a challenger rather than an entrenched titan. The fact that TWC found another partner so quickly underscored that consolidation pressures in the industry had not disappeared. They had simply adapted to the new enforcement climate. Beyond the corporate maneuvers, the merger's demise left open questions about the structure and health of the broadband market itself. Could true competition emerge in an industry with such high barriers to entry? Would wireless, satellite, and fiber challengers ever scale enough to keep the cable incumbents in check? Or would the future of broadband remain in the hands of a few large regional monopolies, their power limited not by market forces but by regulatory vigilance? The case also set the stage for the next battles over net neutrality and digital platform regulation. By proving that control over broadband infrastructure could be a legitimate basis for blocking a merger, the DOJ and FCC had created a precedent that one day could be applied to tech companies controlling app stores, search markets, or cloud infrastructure. In that sense, the fight over Comcast TWC was a preview of larger confrontations to come in the digital economy. And so the story ends where it began, with uncertainty and high stakes. The players have shifted, the deals have changed, but the central tension remains. In industries where technology, content, and distribution converge, who gets to hold the gate and under what rules? The collapse of this merger did not settle that question. It simply ensured that the next attempt would be fought on a battlefield shaped by its legacy. For viewers, investors, and policymakers alike, the lesson was clear. The drama of corporate consolidation is never truly over. It just waits for its next act.